Washington's Peace. It's Complicated. By Finian, Cunningham, SputnikNews.com, January 1, 2016. Wishing others a peaceful new year would seem to be a straightforward greeting for people of goodwill. Not if you're a top U.S. government official. Peace? Yeah, well, it's complicated. This week, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry reportedly phoned Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to firm up the forthcoming peace negotiations, supposedly aimed at bringing an end to the Syrian conflict. But, according to a Reuters report, Kerry's purpose of contacting Lavrov appeared to be less concerned with finding peace and more to do with protecting terrorist outfits in Syria. The Syrian peace talks were given approval by the United Nations last month and are scheduled to begin on January 25 in Geneva. Syria's government of President Bashar Assad recently confirmed that it would be participating in the process, giving a boost to hopes that the 5-year war might come to an end. For the past 3 months, Russia has conducted a ferocious aerial campaign in Syria which has delivered devastating blows to the various illegally armed anti-government militia, including al-Qaeda-linked networks of so-called Islamic State, Daesh, and al-Nusra Front. The latter two are but the most well-known of the radical Islamic terror groups. There are reckoned to be hundreds of other such brigades guided by the same extremists, many would say perverse, views of Islam. Anyone who does not conform to the twisted ideology is liable for punishment by death, including other Muslims as well as Christian, Druze, and Yazidis. Such barbaric, callous, gun-wielding jihadists are ideal proxies for foreign powers who want to terrorize a society for the purpose of destabilizing its government. In short, regime change. The problem for the forthcoming Syrian peace talks, and this may actually scupper the talks, is finding common agreement on which groups constitute legitimate opposition to the Assad government. Strangely, or perhaps not, Washington and Moscow, the two main diplomatic forces behind the Geneva talks, have not yet agreed on an acceptable list of opposition factions. That will, in turn, complicate which groups are eligible for a planned ceasefire. And without a workable ceasefire, there is little chance that the talks will achieve anything. For Moscow, it is straightforward. Foreign mercenaries are not eligible, and those that have committed heinous crimes against humanity are also excluded. Furthermore, opposition groups that demand the ouster of Assad government are non-starters. Lavrov this week reiterated that the political future of Syria is a sovereign matter for the people of Syria to decide through elections. Russia has also a much more realistic understanding of the nature of the Syrian conflict. Its view of all illegally armed groups encompasses more than just the two notorious al-Qaeda franchises of Daesh and Nusra. The two other groups that qualify as terrorist are Jaish al-Islam, Army of Islam, and Ahrar al-Shams. Both of these outfits have a revolving door relationship with Daesh and Nusra by sharing fighters, weapons, and funding sources. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, among the oil-rich Gulf states, have openly bankrolled both Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Shams. When Saudi Arabia convened an opposition summit in Riyadh last month, the objective was to find a common lineup of negotiating groups to participate in the Geneva dialogue. Attending the Saudi summit were delegates from Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Shams. Both groups intend to be part of the Syrian political opposition facing the Assad government. Yet both groups have carried out countless atrocities during the Syrian conflict, including executions and no-warning car bombs in civilian areas. Jaish al-Islam gained further notoriety in November last year when it was reported, even by Western media, that the group was holding civilian hostages in cages as human shields in its stronghold of East Ghouta near the capital Damascus. Nevertheless, Washington endorsed the Saudi summit involving these terror groups as a welcome step for the, quote, peace process in Syria. On December 25, a Russian airstrike killed the commander of Jaish al-Islam, Zahran al-Losh, along with several other senior cadres while they were holding a meeting in East Ghouta. 3 days later, America's top diplomat John Kerry phoned Sergei Lavrov to complain about the direct hit against the Jaish al-Islam leadership. According to Reuters, the U.S. State Department said the killing had complicated efforts to achieve a political settlement, and a point it said U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry made to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in a phone call on Monday, December 28. So Kerry is basically telling Russia to lay off known terrorist groups that have shared American weaponry with Daesh and Nusra in order to give peace a chance in Syria. This flawed logic is consistent with repeated demands from Washington that Moscow must curtail its military operations in Syria to exclusively target Daesh. Even though the illegally armed militia or terrorists in Syria are multifarious, Washington and its NATO allies persist in the risible pretense that the only terror group worthy of combating is ISIS, or Daesh. Even at that, the U.S.-led anti-terror coalition, quote-unquote, including Britain and France, has shown pathetic results in combating ISIS despite a year and a half of bombing Syria illegally for that stated purpose. Washington and its NATO allies have repeatedly refused to share any information with Russia on the location of terror groups in Syria. On December 26th, Pentagon spokeswoman Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Baldanza ruled out any cooperation with Russia, telling Sputnik, quote, "We are not going to cooperate with Russia on Syria until they change their strategy of supporting Assad and instead focus on ISIL." This is what the, quote, peace process in Syria is really all about for Washington and its allies. It is not about finding a genuine, peaceful solution. It is all about achieving regime change by politics, because regime change by proxy war has failed, thanks to Russia's military intervention. That's what Kerry's phone call to Lavrov earlier this week let slip. Kerry is evidently afraid that Russia's legitimate campaign to eradicate terror groups that have no place at the negotiating table will end up jeopardizing the cobbled-together peace process whose purpose for Washington is regime change. Washington's documented association with terror groups in Syria under the guise of supporting phantom, quote, moderates is testimony to its iniquitous, criminal agenda. Wishing peace for Syria in the year ahead is, of course, a righteous, urgent aspiration. But let's be clear, peace does not come about from dealing with charlatans and sponsors of terrorism, who deep down have no interest in peace, but who are only motivated by geopolitical ambitions. There are simple grounds for peace talks in Syria among the government and patriotic opposition groups. For a successful negotiated settlement, what Syrians need is for foreign powers to stop interfering in their country and to stop supporting terrorist proxies. Chief among those nefarious foreign powers is Washington, along with NATO allies Britain and France and client regimes like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. Here's to a peaceful new year, Mr. Kerry. And it's not really complicated. You and your government just need to back off from unlawful interference in other sovereign countries. Is NATO's European honeymoon on the rocks? RobertBridgeRT.com, January 1, 2016. Amid NATO's non-stop campaign of overseas military misadventures, which are displacing millions of people and forcing them to EU shores, Europeans may be finally losing their patience with the military organization's reckless ways. The year 2015 came to a screeching, white-knuckle end for the 28 member states that make up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As Europe struggles to accommodate a tidal wave of refugees escaping the blood and violence of its former colonial lands, right-wing parties are winning over the hearts and minds of Europeans who are increasingly wary of multiculturalism, neoliberal reforms, austerity measures, and now, it seems, even NATO itself. Just this month, Polish military police, accompanied by Antoni Macierewicz, the new defense minister of the newly elected Law and Justice Party, conducted a dramatic midnight raid on a NATO-linked counterintelligence center in Warsaw. Yes, you read that right. Polish authorities conducted a raid on a NATO-linked facility on their own territory. According to the Gazeta Wyborcza newspaper, authorities entered the complex using a duplicate key and then unceremoniously dismissed the director in absentia, Colonel Krzysztof Duza, and replaced him with Colonel Robert Bala. Dozens of other bureaucrats and assorted paper shufflers were also relieved of their shadowy duties on the spot. The former Polish defense minister Tomasz Siemoniak told reporters, quote, "Nothing like this has happened in the history of NATO, where a member state attacks a NATO facility." One NATO official attempted to downplay the unprecedented event, calling the night raid, quote, "an issue for the Polish authorities." But clearly there's much more to the story than the public is being told. After all, what would cause a traditionally pro-Western country like Poland to ignore constitutional due process and risk relations with Brussels, NATO, not to mention the group's top dog, Washington, by conducting a crack of dawn, neo-Nazi-style raid? For those who were surprised by Warsaw's tough tactics, fail to see which way the political winds are blowing, not just in Poland but across the EU. Much of the winds of change howling through the streets of Europe can be connected to the failure of U.S. foreign policy and the repercussions that has had on the European status quo. For much of Europe, no hope, no change. First, the promise of hope and change that failed to materialize under U.S. President Barack Obama has been a major letdown, not just for millions of Americans, but for countless Europeans as well. On April 5, 2009, 20,000 people jammed in front of the Prague Castle to listen to America's first black president seduce his audience with teleprompted tales of peace, prosperity, non-proliferation, and promises, and more promises. In fact, Europe was so giddy about the arrival of Barack Obama that the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded him the Peace Prize just 9 months into his first term as president. Yeah, and was subsequently revoked, and the guy who gave it to him was fired. Look it up. Today, the reality of the farce is painfully conspicuous. Guantanamo Bay detention facility is still open for business. Libya is in dire straits, while the U.S. military is operating in Syria, albeit it with little or no effect on Islamic State, its proclaimed target. Clearly, what Obama has delivered over the course of his 2 terms in office has been strikingly different from the advertisement. Instead of being relieved from the warmongering insanity of the Bush era, the world is still embroiled, knee-deep in crisis, and in new places, Libya, Syria, and Pakistan, that exploded on Obama's watch, as well as in Russia, where the Kremlin wised up fast to the fairy tale known as reset. The one bright spot in U.S. foreign policy has been the Obama administration's conclusion of a controversial nuclear deal with Iran, yet judging by recent events, which included the U.S. Navy accusing Iran of firing missiles in proximity of the aircraft carrier USS Harry S. Truman in the Persian Gulf, charges Tehran has slammed as, quote, psychological warfare. But the crisis now enveloping the world is not limited to those of military nature. Ever since the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic setback since the Great Depression, Europe has been mired in dismal economic growth and high unemployment, compounded by an insane influx of millions of refugees that are only serving to erode Europe's financial prospects, to say nothing about demographics. And in order to cure the disease of insolvency, many once proud, self-sufficient European countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece, to name a few, are forced to rely on impossible-to-return loans from the same global bankers that wrecked these national economies in the first place. The fact that only isolated Iceland was politically independent enough to punish its bankers and restructure its economy without suicidal austerity measures proves that Europe is under the influence of powers far beyond the control of democratic procedure. The lesson that Europeans learned was an old one. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. Can't get fooled again. Haha, just kidding. Shame on me. Ever since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Washington, and by extension NATO, has only delivered Europe a series of global military debacles that the old world, already suffering under the brutal dictate of IMF debt and World Bank measures, can now ill afford. Now toss a few million desperate refugees into the mix and you have awakened a raw spirit of right-wing political parties from Le Pen's National Front National in France to Golden Dawn in Greece. The Financial Times, sympathizing with the neoliberal globalists, summed up the scenario that is playing itself out in national elections across the EU, quote, "All over the world, globalization is under challenge from resurgent nationalist forces. One of the great political challenges of the coming year will be to defend the benefits of globalization, while fending off the arguments of nationalists such as Mrs. Le Pen, Donald Trump in the U.S., and his new admirer, President Vladimir Putin of Russia." RT failed to mention, of course, that globalization thus far has been a boon for the transnational corporations and a total bust for the denizens of the global village. Personally, I can't imagine that in a situation where nearly every U.S. foreign policy initiative over the last 15 years has resulted in utter chaos and catastrophe, the European people, still highly educated despite biting austerity, will fail to correctly add 2 plus 2 and conclude that NATO is an institution designed to defend their interests. As an institution designed to defend their interests is also failing them in dramatic fashion. The Western military bloc continues to agitate Russia, pushing smack against the very border of NATO's Cold War nemesis, while recklessly hampering one of Europe's most reliable trading partners. The Cold War, according to reliable history books, has been over for about a quarter of a century. Yet the Western military bloc continues to incite Russia with clearly threatening moves, most notably the missile defense shield in Eastern Europe, which Russia has warned will upset the strategic balance and invoke a new arms race. But judging by the frustration and even anger of many European people, which is manifesting itself in the rise of far-right movements that are serving up the heavy cocktail of national patriotism and economic protectionism, NATO's European honeymoon really may be hitting the rocks. In addition to the Polish midnight raid on the NATO-linked center comes this news. German politicians slammed the Merkel government as well as NATO command after it emerged that German troops will be sent to help NATO member Turkey defend its border without notifying parliamentarians in the Bundestag. Quote, "The government must immediately inform Parliament of the details of this deployment, in particular what missions will be assigned to these planes and the destination of any data they collect." Tobias Linder, the Green Party's head of defense issues, stated in the German daily Bild. Yet Berlin, sounding every bit as arrogant and self-important as Washington these days, declared it has no intention of consulting the Bundestag, Germany's lower house of parliament, for approval. The unilateral, undemocratic transfer of German troops, units of the AWACS data collecting aircraft, on the part of NATO and the Merkel government, comes amid smoldering tensions ever since Ankara shot down a Russian fighter jet that Turkey claims entered its airspace for a whole 17 seconds. Although these two events in two major European countries may be nothing more than mere blips on the radar screen concerning NATO's relationship with Europe, they could also be warning signals of an approaching earthquake in which the steady encroachment of nationalistic political demands begin to seriously clash with NATO's global objectives, which at this stage don't seem remotely concerned with the true well-being and security of the European people. Europeans finally losing patience with NATO's reckless mess. SputnikNews.com, amid the mounting refugee crisis caused by NATO's non-stop campaign of overseas military misadventures. Europeans are becoming increasingly wary of multiculturalism, neoliberal reforms, austerity measures, and now, it seems, even NATO itself, according to American writer and journalist Robert Bridge. Bridge cites as an example a recent raid conducted by the Polish military police with the endorsement the country's defense minister Antoni Macierewicz on a NATO-linked counterintelligence center in Warsaw as an example. In his opinion piece for RT's website, Bridge quotes the Polish newspaper Gazeta Wyborcza, according to which, quote, authorities entered the complex using a duplicate key and then unceremoniously dismissed the director in absentia, Colonel Krzysztof Duza, and replaced him with Colonel Robert Bala. Dozens of other bureaucrats and assorted paper shufflers were also relieved of their shadowy duties on the spot, end quote. This picture shows sealed entry to the NATO Counterintelligence Center of Excellence in Warsaw. Nothing like this has happened in the history of NATO, where a member state attacks a NATO facility, former Polish Defense Minister Tomasz Zamoniak commented on the incident to reporters. Quote, after all, what would cause a traditionally pro-Western country like Poland to ignore constitutional due process and risk relations with Brussels, NATO, not to mention the group's top dog Washington, by conducting a crack-of-dawn neo-Nazi-style raid? Bridge therefore questions, and then provides an answer, quote, those who were surprised by Warsaw's tough tactics fail to see which way the political winds are blowing not just in Poland, but across the EU. The author further elaborates that, quote, much of the winds of change howling through the streets of Europe can be connected to the failure of U.S. foreign policy and the repercussions that has had on the European status quo. Bridge then provides other examples of the failed promises that President Obama so easily gave away to Europe back in 2009 and the gloomy reality, quote, Guantanamo Bay detention facility is still open for business. Libya is in dire straits, while the U.S. military is operating in Syria, albeit with little or no effect on Islamic State, its proclaimed target. Instead of being relieved from the warmongering insanity of the Bush era, the world is still embroiled knee-deep in crisis and in new places. Libya, Syria, Pakistan, that exploded on Obama's watch, as well as in Russia, where the Kremlin wised up fast to the fairy tale known as reset. The author, however, notes that the, quote, crises now enveloping the world are not limited to those of a military nature. Ever since the 2008 financial crisis, the world economic setback since the Great Depression, Europe has been mired in dismal economic growth and high unemployment, compounded by an insane influx of millions of refugees that are only serving to erode Europe's financial prospects, to say nothing about demographics. To cope with all the hardships, quote, many once proud self-sufficient European countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece, to name a few, are forced to take on loans, quote, from the very same global bankers that wrecked these national economies in the first place. Quote, ever since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Washington, and by extension NATO, has only delivered Europe as a series of global military debacles that the old world, already suffering under the brutal dictate of IMF debt and World Bank measures, can now ill afford. Now toss a few million desperate refugees into the mix and you have awakened the raw spirit of right-wing political parties, from Le Pen's Front National in France to Golden Dawn in Greece. Personally, I can't imagine that in a situation where nearly every U.S. foreign policy initiative over the last 15 years has resulted in utter chaos and catastrophe, the European people, still hardly educated despite biting austerity, will fail to correctly add 2 plus 2 and conclude that NATO as an institution designed to defend their interests is also failing them in dramatic fashion. Bridge therefore concludes,